Okay, I think we're ready to proceed to our second panel. We have assembled here this morning for our second session three illustrious speakers. Their biographies should speak for themselves, but I can give just a very quick introduction. What I thought we'd do is go in the order as listed on the agenda, starting off with Tetsuo Kotani, who will give us an initial presentation, followed up by Akira Murasaki from Japan's Ministry of Defense, and then finally have Dean Cheng from Heritage Foundation give us his thoughts, and then we'll run through it, and afterwards we'll go into a question and answer session. Perhaps each speaker take about maybe 10 minutes or so, if that'll work, and leave the rest to question and answer. So with that, Tetsuo, if you want to start off.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tetsuo Kotani, Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs in Tokyo, and I'm also International Advisor to Project 2049. And I'm sorry I couldn't finish my paper for distribution, so I just prepared some slides. And the title of my paper would be, Can PLA Navy Go Beyond the First Island Chain? So let me begin with this map. China is developing the A2AD capabilities, that's we all know. But at the same time, China is seeking access to the open ocean. And China has 9 exits to the open ocean. As you can see, there are 6 straits belonging to Japan, meaning that Japan is in a position to control the 6 out of 9 Chinese exits to the open ocean. PLA Navy, next slide, please. This is not the one. Well, for some reason the map is gone, but you can see the Japanese defense white paper. You have a opposite map, upside down map, and Chinese Navy is now very much active in the particularly in the Japanese southwestern island chain. And the main route for the PLA Navy is the Miyako Channel, which is between the Okinawa main island and the Miyako Island. The Miyako Island, Miyako Strait is the widest gap in the first island chain. So we frequently monitor the Chinese naval activities through this Miyako Strait. And Chinese Navy is now active even beyond the first island chain and closer to the second island chain. But I see 2 primary challenges for the PLA Navy operating in the Western Pacific. The first challenge is the lack of ASW, anti-submarine warfare capabilities. There's a frequent report about the development of China's ASW capabilities program. But for example, last year when the Malaysian Airlines aircraft disappeared, U.S., Japan, U.S. sent the P-8 and Japan and Australia sent the P-3C. But China sent the JL-67, which is basically a transport aircraft. China couldn't send ASW maritime patrol aircraft to the search operation, which indicates the lack of China's maritime ISR capabilities. So as long as China's ASW capability is insufficient, Chinese surface ships operating in the open ocean will continue to be vulnerable to the attack from the underwater. So that's the #1 challenge for the PLA Navy. And the challenge number 2 challenge is the lack of fleet air defense capabilities. China's aircraft carrier program it's still a joke. And the first carrier, Liaoning, I don't call it the aircraft carrier because it is not carrying any aircraft. It's just a large flat top or a transport ship. And it will take decades, not years, for China to develop a reliable carrier. So PLA Navy will continue to face a difficulty for the fleet air defense in the open ocean. Next slide, please. But instead, China is trying to increase their air cover activities by shore-based aircraft. And China's air activities in the Western Pacific increased after 2010. And as we all know, China announced the ADIZ in 2013. And this red line indicates the basic flight pattern of China's intelligence gathering aircraft. After the announcement of ADIZ, China's ISR operations have increased inside the ADIZ. Next slide, please. And this is the basic flight pattern of China's fighters. China's fighters basically come up to the median line of the East China Sea, and this flight pattern indicates the limitation of China's shore-based coastal radar system. So China's coastal radar can cover up to the median line of the East China Sea, but beyond the median line, that's a blind spot for the PLA Air Force. And the next slide, please. But still, they have a different flight pattern, which go beyond the first island chain. This is a flight pattern of bombers and intelligence gathering aircraft. But whenever those aircraft go beyond the first island chain, we monitor they are escorted by early warning aircraft. So without early warning aircraft, China cannot go beyond the first island chain. And next slide, please. And Chinese PLA Navy and PLA Air Force are now increasing their joint operations. And this is the illustration of the recent joint exercises by PLA Navy and Air Force in the Western Pacific. PLA Navy fleet, including the Luzhou Chinese version of Aegis destroyer, passing through, not this one, sorry. Next slide, please. No, this one, sorry. The blue route indicates the PLA fleet activities. They pass through one of the Japanese straits called Osumi, and then enter the open ocean. And they come down to the blue area. And also the red line indicates the Chinese bombers and the early warning aircraft and intelligence gathering aircraft. So they joined in the Western Pacific and conducted the largest scale military exercise in December last year. So their joint operations are increasing in the Western Pacific so that the PLA Navy can get the air cover by the PLA Air Force. But as I said, Chinese air cover still depends on the early warning aircraft. So if this early warning aircraft is shut down, then the Chinese fleet in the open ocean will be very much vulnerable from the attack, from the air attack. Yes, but alternatively, China can increase their air superiority in the Western Pacific, first of all, by neutralizing the Japanese and American Air Force. So China can neutralize our Japan and American Air Force based in Japan by precision strikes. And I think Mr. Marusaki will explain the Chinese precision capabilities. And another alternative for China is to obtain unsinkable aircraft carrier, which is the first island chain. Japan's southwestern island chain consists of 800 islands, and out of 800, 19 islands have airfields. And for example, the Ishigaki Island and the Shimojishima Island have more than 3,000 meter airstrip. So if China can take those islands, they can use this island as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And at this moment, there's no ground troops protecting those islands. And so for China, it's a very easy target to take. China doesn't have to take an amphibious invasion of those islands. China can send a armored fishermen to those islands, and then those armed fishermen can take the control of those islands. So the next slide, please. Let me say a few words on the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, as we all know now, China is constructing facilities and constructing artificial islands. And particularly, next slide, please. This is from the CSIS Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. China has already constructed the long runway and woody islands in the parcels. And next. And China is constructing a island in artificial island in the Fairy Cross Reef. And next slide, please. This is the design from the Chinese official website. This is a future of Johnson South Reef. And next slide, please. This is the current situation of Johnson South Reef. So it's almost there. Next slide, please. No slide? Okay. Okay. Sorry for the confusion. So China is also trying to establish, oh yes, this one. Perhaps this is too heavy. It takes some time, it's heavy. So hopefully it come out. So first of all, China will try to, if we go to war with China, China will first of all try to neutralize our Air Force by ballistic missiles. And then they will try to take some of our southwestern islands, which have a long runway. And they try to operate their Air Force from those unsinkable aircraft carrier. So, oh yeah, it's, okay. Next slide, please. So let me conclude with the implications for the alliance. First of all, Japan and the United States should continue to sufficient ISR capabilities in the Western Pacific, particularly for anti-submarine warfare. And the introduction of P8 for U.S. Navy and the P1 for Maritime Self-Defense Force will rapidly increase our capabilities. The Paul Giara asked the Japanese participation in the patrol in the South China Sea. Personally, I welcome the suggestion from the Admiral Thomas, and I think Maritime Self-Defense Force should seek a way to engage the ISR activities in the South China Sea. Capability-wise, we have, and legally, no problem, because we can conduct surveillance in the international waters. So the only issue is the political will. If we can get the political will, I think Japan can join the South China Sea Patrol. And second implication is the importance of air superiority. First of all, we have to prepare the China's precision strike against the bases in Okinawa. And we basically have three options. One is disposal, second is the hardening, and the third one is the resilience. And we have to find a fairly good balance of these three options in Okinawa. And also we have to protect our remote islands, particularly the Ishigaki and Shimojishima Islands, which have the long runway. And we have to, there's already a plan to deploy our ground forces to some of those islands as the first responder. But at the same time, we are developing rapid deployment capabilities from mainland to the southwestern island chain. And I think this will increase our deterrence very much. And finally, the South China Sea, China is just doing what they want. And no matter what we say to the land reclamation activities, I don't think China will stop those activities. So I think we have to think how we can stop. And my humble suggestion is Japan and the United States encourage the other South China Sea claimants, particularly the Vietnamese and the Philippines, to conduct a quarantine, a kind of quarantine, to stop the movement of ships which carry the construction materials. I think China will be angry about it, but China has to respect for our determined actions. So that's something I think we have to consider. Otherwise, China will just establish air superiority in the South China Sea and announce a ADIZ sometime soon. That's all I have. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My comments today are going to be about Chinese perspectives on military space, particularly focusing on counter-space operations. Chinese views on the importance of space do not occur within a vacuum. Rather, they are part of the larger Chinese view of the nature of modern and future warfare. Although the Chinese People's Liberation Army has not fought a war since 1979, they have been assiduous students of other people's wars, and especially those of the United States. Having observed our conflicts from the first Gulf War to Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, through our operations in the Balkans, the war in Afghanistan, and the war with Iraq, the PLA has reached several conclusions. Here I will be focusing on space, but as Mr. Marasaki pointed out, this has obviously had implications for other weapons developments as well. First, that future wars will involve joint operations. Chinese observations stemming back to the first Gulf War is that future conflicts have involved not only land, sea, and air domains, but also outer space and cyberspace. And in order to achieve victory, you need the participation of all the various services operating across all of these domains to achieve victory. The reason for the need for all of this is in part because you create synergies through cooperation, but you also cover each individual service and each individual domain's vulnerabilities. Think of it as overlapping plates of armor. The ability to conduct joint operations, which can span millions of cubic kilometers, reaching from outer space to the ocean depths and spanning continents, requires common situational awareness, extensive communications networks, and arrays of precision munitions. Future wars, therefore, in the Chinese lexicon, will not be based on individual weapons or even weapons systems, 系统, but systems of systems, 体系. These systems of systems, in turn, will be bound together through information. For this reason, the PLA has concluded that wars in the information age will be local wars under informationized conditions, much as wars in the industrial age were mechanized wars. The ability to fight and win local wars under informationized conditions, however, in turn rests upon the ability to establish information dominance or information superiority, 自信喜权. This is the ability to collect, transmit, and exploit information at times and places of one's own choosing in an expeditious and accurate manner while denying an opponent the same ability. Because space systems play such a key role in the collection, transmission, and exploitation of information, space superiority, or space dominance, is therefore viewed by the PLA as an essential means of seizing and maintaining information dominance, and thereby securing the initiative in the context of local wars under informationized conditions. This interest in space dominance has been noted in various American intelligence assessments. General Vincent Stewart of the DIA recently noted, for example, that several nations, including China, are developing counter-space capabilities. Quote, the threat to U.S. space systems and services will increase as potential adversaries pursue disruptive and destructive counter-space capabilities. Chinese and Russian military leaders understand the unique information advantages afforded by space systems. Chinese military writings specifically highlight the need to interfere with, damage, and destroy reconnaissance, navigation, and communication satellites. General Vincent's reference to writings spans a range of potential documents. For example, the 2013 volume of the Science of Military Strategy that Dennis Blasko referenced in the first panel specifically includes a chapter that discusses space and cyber domains of strategy. This chapter notes the importance of space has grown significantly for military as well as broader national purposes. Another volume that General Vincent might have been referencing is the PLA Encyclopedia. In the 2007 edition, in the volume on military strategy, the definition of the term space dominance specifically notes, quote, space dominance will be a vital factor in securing air dominance, maritime dominance, and electromagnetic dominance, and will directly affect the course and outcome of wars. Yet another reference to space dominance arises in Chinese military teaching materials, where there is a much more extensive discussion of PLA thinking about space operations and space combat. Here, the Chinese have clearly devoted substantial intellectual effort and energy to discuss how the whys and wherefores of space dominance. Let me note here, it is important to remember that Chinese military doctrine does not map directly onto our own concept or our own terminology. For the U.S., military space operations are comprised of space situational awareness, space force enhancement, space support, space control, and space force application. According to the Science of Space Operations teaching materials, on the other hand, the Chinese conceive of space superiority as involving the ability to undertake space deterrence, space blockades, space offensive operations, space defensive operations, and space information support. The conduct of space operations, according to PLA analyses, is marked by certain characteristics. Space warfare is seen as a high-intensity form of conflict. There will be very limited available forces due to the fact that space systems are expensive, even in China. It is offense dominant. It is very hard to defend or preserve orbital assets, and the overall space architecture, which includes ground facilities, mission control centers, launch facilities, tracking, telemetry, and control, the data links that tie orbital assets together with the ground facilities, all of that is very fragile and very brittle. And the fundamental reality is systems that are in orbit basically are fairly easy to destroy and are very hard to harden. It's not like you can armor them. Death Stars are great in movies, but in fact, they are very vulnerable even to microsatellites, never mind deliberately targeted anti-satellite systems. PLA writing suggests that there is, in fact, a guiding thought that is evolving for space operations, and that this is embodied at this point as active defense, all aspects unified, key point is space dominance. And each of these terms has significant meaning. Active defense, of course, is how the Chinese conceive of their own military strategy. The term active defense automatically brings with it a large tractor-trailer load of various concepts and meaning. At a minimum, it emphasizes seizing the initiative and not simply assuming a reactive mode. All aspects unified refers to several things. It means that all space assets, military, civilian, and commercial, are part of the struggle for space dominance. This has distinct implications for national defense mobilization of not only civilian and commercial satellites, but also, for example, of universities and scientific research space facilities, of academic and civilian space personnel. All aspects unified also refers to the integration of space operations with land, sea, air, cyber, and electronic warfare operations. So sometimes you hear the idea of, well, could you have a space war? Could you just sort of plink away at one or two satellites? And in theory, you might do that, but in the context of Chinese thinking, it is far more likely that space operations will occur within the broader context of larger military operations. And finally, key point space dominance, first off, refers to the importance of establishing space dominance for oneself, but also noting the essential need to deny an enemy the ability to exploit space. Because there will be limited space assets, one therefore needs to focus on establishing space dominance. This can't be an afterthought. And you need to prevent an opponent from doing the same. So when you are doing your missile targeting, when you're doing your air targeting, when you're doing your ground force targeting, keep in mind the need to allocate assets towards helping to establish space dominance. And because space assets are expensive and fragile, use your space systems at key times and places. Don't fritter them away in secondary theaters. Don't fritter them away to support secondary efforts. Focus them towards your main, to borrow the German term, the Schwerpunkt. Space operations, consistent with the guiding thought of active defense, all aspects unified, key point is space dominance, then include space deterrence, space blockades, the offensive and defensive operations, and space information support. Now, each of these is an extensive discussion, and in the interest of time, particularly because I forgot to warn you folks that this could get extended, so you should have all gotten coffee. Let me focus here just on space offensive operations. According to PLA teaching materials, space offensive operations are unlikely to occur on their own. They are part of larger joint operations. They are not simply focused on shooting at satellites. We very often think that space offense is going to look a lot like Star Wars, laser battle stations, or in the slightly less CGI'd version, ground-launched kinetic kill vehicles like what we saw in 2007. But the Chinese discuss space offensive and defensive operations as, again, involving this entire architecture. So if I go to attack launch facilities, that is part of space offensive operations. If I engage in cyber activities, that too is part of space offensive operations. So here the Chinese, in fact, do discuss a variety of types of weapons, and disturbingly there is evidence that each of these categories has enjoyed a major Chinese R&D and even production effort. So some of the types of systems that the Chinese have talked about include directed energy weapons, including lasers. In 2006, the United States reported that China had fired lasers at U.S. satellites. Now, what is unclear is whether this was a deliberate attempt to blind American satellites, because the Chinese have engaged in research into laser ranging and the like. Other countries have done the same. So it is difficult to say whether or not this is specifically whether that test was in fact a test of a laser blinding system. But it is noteworthy that the Chinese have talked about the need for that. Second, kinetic kill vehicles. Of course, in 2007, China demonstrated a KKV. It has mounted at least 3 missile defense tests that involved exo-atmospheric interceptions. And of course, a missile defense system capable of exo-atmospheric interception can, in fact, have anti-satellite capabilities, as our own interception of US 193 and Operation Burnt Frost demonstrated. In 2013, however, China also reportedly tested an anti-satellite system that really sort of broke new ground, at least broke new ground in space. A bit of an oxymoron, by evidently being able to target satellites in geosynchronous orbit. And this is a major new advance, because no other nation has demonstrated such a capability. And this is, in fact, one of the most important pieces of outer space. From geosynchronous space, you basically can park a satellite, and with minor fuel adjustments for station keeping, you can keep watch over Earth. That's where many of the most important communication satellites are located. It's also where the missile early warning satellites are located. So the ability to target systems out there is really a major step forward. Interestingly, the Chinese talk about manned vehicles as having a major role to play in space control. Now, it's not clear how viable such efforts might be. After all, satellites could be booby-trapped, and manned systems themselves take up a lot of volume in any mission with life support. People are very, very vulnerable in space. But the Chinese do talk about the possible utility of them. Space mines and anti-satellite satellites. Interestingly, this is broken out separate from kinetic kill vehicles. Now, in theory, any satellite can be used as an anti-satellite weapon, assuming that one has good space situational awareness, enough fuel on board the satellite, and sufficiently precise controls of the satellite. The PRC, however, has demonstrated capabilities that suggest more tailored co-orbital anti-satellite capabilities. In August 2010, Chinese satellites SJ-06F and SJ-12 bumped each other. Their orbital tracks suggest that this was a deliberate conjunction, not an accident. If you take a look at the track, one of the satellites spirals in steadily, which means that it was under some level of control, because satellites in orbit don't tend to spiral. In July 2013, China launched 3 satellites at once, Chongqing 3, Shiyan 7, and Shijian 15. The largest of these, and it's not clear which of these that was apparently equipped with a robot arm and may have rendezvoused with one of the other satellites. The same satellite, Blip, apparently later rendezvoused with a separate Chinese satellite, Shijian 7, apparently again may have used its robotic arm to do a physical link-up. There have been some much more extensive studies into Chinese robotic arm development for satellites. The larger point here being that these robot arms, on the one hand, can be used to help service a satellite, sort of unscrew a fuel cap and put a hose in. I'm speaking metaphorically, of course. But alternative can also rip off solar panels or otherwise damage instrument pallets. And finally, the Chinese do talk about soft kill technologies. And what is interesting here is that they see soft kill technologies not as an either or, an alternative, but as a complement to hard kill. Basically, soft kill, one, they note, has the specific advantage of deniability, of attribution. Did we soft kill that satellite, or is it simply suffering from solar weather? Was that jamming, or was it just a computer program gone haywire? As we've seen already this morning, sometimes that happens without the benefit of enemy interference. We assume, of course, that was the case. But also, soft kill doesn't necessarily generate the same diplomatic repercussions. On the other hand, when you absolutely positively need to kill something, hard kill does do the trick and has the added advantage of, in a sense, battle damage assessment. The satellite that is now a cloud of debris is dead, whereas how do you know whether soft kill worked or not? What is striking here is reports of Chinese intrusions into the U.S. weather satellite system and also into the associated databases highlights precisely the kinds of operations that the PLA in its own writing talks about. Now, the implications for Japan and the United States are significant because, as was already noted, China fields a remarkably overlapping array of systems for ISR, over-the-horizon backscatter, AGIs, fishing fleets, UAVs, etc., because China's military operations will, for the most part, occur off its own coast. China doesn't have to rely on space systems. Space systems are good, are useful, especially the farther away you get from China. But the fundamental reality is that for the United States, all of our games are away games, and we certainly want to keep that to be the case. Fighting in the Gulf of Mexico is not something the U.S. really wants to do. But that means that we, unlike China, have a far smaller array of sensors to rely upon. And that really puts the emphasis on space systems. Deny the United States the ability to exploit space, and we operate half-blind. We cannot coordinate our forces nearly as well, and operating in the face of the substantial array of missiles of various sorts, aircraft, etc., means really sticking our heads into the mouth of a tiger that hasn't necessarily been anesthetized. Let me conclude then by noting at this point that it is not known whether the PLA has issued a formal doctrine governing military space operations. The Chinese, despite their protests of transparency, don't tend to release their gangyao, their doctrine, in nice, neat little packages, and certainly aren't amenable to FOIA requests. However, the issuance of so many key Chinese military documents, including a new encyclopedia, a new volume on terminology, series of teaching materials, and the new Science of Military Strategy, does suggest that there has been an updating of the PLA's doctrine since 1999, which has sometimes been termed the Year of Regulations. And if so, it is quite likely that this has included a doctrine governing space operations, including the establishment of space dominance. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I'd like to express appreciation to our three speakers for three brilliant presentations. So what I'd like to do now, I think we have about maybe 10, 15 more minutes, is exercise the moderator's prerogative and start off with a question. So beginning with, in terms of just a quick observation, sort of bringing the first panel's discussion and Dennis's presentation on the PLA, which I thought was very, very, very well done and very little to disagree with at all. And to highlight one point that Dennis made was the role of the PLA as the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. That it's a party army, which is a major difference from what we have here in the United States military. Because when we think of military, we think of pure hardcore, sort of hard military war fighting. Whereas in the PLA, one of the main differences between the PLA and the U.S. military and other militaries around the world it is an institutionalized, organized approach to, for example, deterrence. Dennis mentioned political warfare, which I would highlight even more as a key function of the PLA. Every military action that the PLA would take has a lot more of an accentuated political goal. There's an organization within the General Political Department that is dedicated to nothing but amplifying or attenuating real or perceived military capabilities. And it's something that we don't have. And it's a very time-honored tradition within the PLA. So with that as context, the question that I would start off with is, since 2008, there's been a significant uptick, of course, in operations in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, but whether it's PLA or civilian organizations. But at the same time, there's been a parallel decrease in activities that we would see directed against Taiwan. And would like to highlight last year's DoD report to Congress on piercing military power that made the statement, and this is to paraphrase, that the primary focus of the PLA today remains Taiwan. The main strategic direction of the PLA remains Taiwan. But yet here in Washington, D.C., Taiwan is pretty much off the agenda. It's very rarely discussed, whether it's in terms of the rebalance, for example. Very rarely do you see Taiwan out there. But what it's done is with all the attention being focused on territorial disputes in South China Sea and East China Sea. And the question I would have is this intentional or is it just coincidental? In other words, when you think of sort of the idea of what the main threat is to the Chinese Communist Party, which is the threat that Taiwan and its democratic system of government, how it poses a central existential threat to the to the monopoly the Chinese Communist Party has. What's the disconnect? In other words, why do we see a lot less on Taiwan, but a lot of attention focused on territorial disputes, just in terms of the public domain, the perceptual domain? We'll throw that out to our panelists. Actually, that's a good suggestion. So just throw that out first, and then let's go ahead and take maybe three or so other questions, and then sort of we can address them all at one time, and so we can adjourn for lunch afterwards. Back in the back, yes, sir.
Yes, Henry Hetker, Research Now. I've read that China has refused to arbitrate the South China Sea islands as far as who should retain control of what and whose territory should extend into that area. It would be very simple if that could be done, but it appears if they can't do that or refuse to do it, the problem will only gradually become more serious. That being the case, this unsinkable aircraft carrier you mentioned on the Johnson Reef, is that in an area that should be under the Philippines, theoretically? I know the Philippines have left a large ship somewhere to show a claim on a certain island. I don't know if that's in the same area or not. Perhaps you can elucidate on this.
All right, thank you. Other question? Nadia?
Hi, Nadia Chao with the Liberty Times, Taiwan. My first question is that in 1996, after the Taiwan Missile Crisis, we see that the PLA learned the lesson. There's a change in their strategy and the capability. But I'm just wondering, at the Senkaku, crisis, has Japan seen this kind of a change as well? Is there a change of the status quo or a change of the PLA strategy and capability due to this crisis? And my second question is, some people in Washington believe with the relaxation or the rather stable cross-strait relationship in the past 6-7 years, that's why PLA is able to focusing on other issues like South China Sea and East China Sea. Do you agree this kind of observation? Do you think that with the coming election in Taiwan, there will be maybe some change in the cross-strait relationship that will change China's calculation of its neighborhood? Thanks.
Yes, Scott?
Scott Harold from the Rand Corporation. Marusaki-san and Kotani-san, I'm going to ask a question that may be too sensitive for a currently serving MOD official to answer. So if so, Kotani-san, please adopt your JIIA unofficial hat and provide some thoughts. Given the reliance of China on space to carry out long-range precision-guided strike against Japanese assets, potentially against U.S. assets, does that mean that maybe for Japan, the need to be able to execute counter-space offensive strike should be a priority, since this is, in some sense, less escalatory insofar as no one dies in space if you strike a satellite? Of course, there does go to the issue of command and control, potentially even over strategic assets. But I wonder if you could characterize for us Japanese scholars and policy analysts' thinking on the issue of offensive counterspace as a way to break China's kill chain. Thank you.
Oh, we can take one last question. Back in the back.
Hi, Dan Katz with Aviation Week. I want to return and ask a couple of questions regarding the issue of the southwestern islands. First, could someone perhaps elaborate on Japan's current plans to deploy troops to the island? Just a little bit more detail. Two, is there any thinking in Japan to use these islands for the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force to achieve the dispersal effect that was talked about? And third, the United States Marine Corps has described a scheme of operations in which small packets of F-35Bs would operate from forward arming and refueling points, rapidly changing their locations to stay within the targeting cycle of a near-peer adversary's long-range precision strike capability. For anyone who would like to up there, could you please express your opinion of this? Is this a scheme of operations that you think would be effective and useful?
All right, thank you. Let's go ahead and see if we can address the question, starting with Tetsuo, as well as any final observations that you may have.
Okay, so how many minutes do I have?
2.5 minutes.
Okay, 2. So on Mark's first question, I think there are several reasons why the Taiwan became less important in our discussion, in Chinese discussion. First of all, there was Mainijo came up, and they and also China became more preoccupied with territorial disputes with other neighboring countries. But to me, the reason China is trying to excuse me, their territories in both East China Sea and South China Sea is to increase their A2AD capabilities to defend Taiwan. So in that sense, those issues are all interconnected. So I don't think China, is now, putting more emphasis on, East China Sea or South China Sea. I think, the core issue still remains Taiwan. And the Scott's question about the offensive space strike capabilities. All I can say is there is a discussion in Japan whether Japan should seek a comprehensive ban on ASAT, or Japan should, keep some room for a development of such capabilities without, seeking a comprehensive ban on the ASAT. So that indicates, there's some discussion going on in Tokyo. That's all I can say. And the Southwestern Island defense, yes, the officially the Japanese government is now deploying ground troops in the Yonaguni Island, which is the westernmost island, and also there's a discussion going on whether we should deploy additional ground troops in the other islands such as Miyako or Amami, Oshima. But to me, the most important island is Ishigaki Island, and unless we can deploy ground troops in Ishigaki, our southwestern island defense cannot be perfect. Perhaps that's all I can say.
Right, thank you.
So very quickly, on the issue of why has the Taiwan issue been quiet? Well, in the United States, it's because we are a nation that plays kids soccer. If you ever watch children playing soccer, basically, wherever the ball is, all the kids, go wandering off. And right now we have lots of issues, right? You have ISIS, you have Crimea, you have email servers, you have all sorts of other things, far more important to talk about. In China, I suspect that it's not discussed because why rock a boat that is at the moment fairly stable? But that does raise the real prospect that in 2016, when you have elections in Taiwan, there is this tendency in democracies that parties that get elected twice tend to lose the third time around. Not always, but often that's the case. So there is a potential here that you could wind up with the DPP government in 2016. And let me emphasize here, this is not a prediction, this is not a statement of preference. All I'm saying is that you have this tendency in democracies to throw the bums out, whoever the bums are, Republicans, Democrats, Labor, Christian Democrats, whatever. But that would mean that in 2016 you would wind up with, one, a new government in Taiwan that may be a different political party. Two, a leadership in China that itself has not been part of the past DPP situation in the Taiwan Straits, because Xi Jinping wasn't in charge back between 2000 and 2008. And back to kids soccer again, the United States is going to be focused on our own elections, a period, therefore, of maximal instability. As for changes since in the Senkakus, I would just note, and this is correlation, not causation, that the Chinese did consolidate their maritime law enforcement agencies after 2010. So that presumably has streamlined at least some of their ability to react and allocate assets. While Scott did not ask me this question, I'm going to take the liberty of trying to address his question anyway, which is there's an implicit assumption there that the Chinese need space to do targeting on Japan. Japan's a heck of a lot closer to China than it is to us. I would suggest that the Chinese don't necessarily need space to target Japanese facilities. And second of all, that it's one thing if you're going to be very precise and you want to be able to always put your bomb through the fourth window pane on the left, et cetera. If I simply want to flatten the base, or even just want to flatten the fuel hangars and repair facilities, I don't need exquisite centimeter CEP. I think I can probably live with a 5-meter CEP, which I can probably do with Beidou and other things out at GEO, or simply a lot of people walking around while I'm doing my deliveries of getting GPS coordinates when I drop off your Amazon.jp package. And finally, on the issue of the Chinese not arbitrating the South China Sea, I think that the question goes to the Pagasa Reef Thitu Island question, and I don't know whether or not the second, whether or not the islands, Johnson Reef, et cetera, are part of the Philippine claim. But I think from the Chinese perspective, it's all irrelevant, right? Because these islands are Chinese, all of them, from the Chinese perspective. And as long as the Chinese get to that point, it doesn't really matter whether we're not, what you call them, potato, war for that matter, whether or not there's anybody else there, because as long as everybody recognizes. And it's interesting to note here that, the Chinese are refusing arbitration under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the United States is not a party to. Oh, wait, the U.S. isn't party. But the U.S. isn't party to this dispute either. The Filipinos did sign the treaty. So did the Chinese. So evidently, signing UNCLOS is irrelevant to what the Chinese, again, are emphasizing is their own territorial claim.
Excellent. Thank you to our panelists for, I think, a very illuminating session. I think we're going to adjourn for lunch, and we'll have our keynote speaker as our next presentation. It's about maybe 10 minutes. Yeah. Thank you.